finest symbol of excellence in sports entertainment.
Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Can Chris Hero Save Wrestling exclusively on adfreeshows.com. And of course, we couldn't do it without the man himself, Mr. Chris Hero. Chris, how are you, man?
Isn't it great to be alive and well in Charlestown, Indiana on a Saturday night, Conrad Thompson? I have all the respect in the world for you, but before I bust you up and beat you up, I'm going to give you the wrestling lesson of a lifetime.
Today, in case you haven't figured it out, we're going to be paying tribute to one of our favorite wrestlers ever and one of Chris's best friends and mentor. We're going to hear all about that today. Mr. Tracy Smothers. Unfortunately, we lost Tracy last year, and my goodness, I'm looking forward to today's episode. But before we talk about it, let's talk about last week. Dude, I was overwhelmed with the positive feedback we got from our debut episode. What'd you see?
Yeah, man, I thought so. I sent it off to a couple friends of mine whose opinion I respect greatly, and just got some great notes. I'm so excited about this, man. There's so many directions we can go in. I know there were some people that are kind of like, well, what is this show really? And that first episode was just kind of a catch up to get us to where we are now, but we're going to be covering all kinds of stuff. We'll go through my 22 plus year career, different little segments, opponents that I've had, matches that I've had, but we'll also cover tidbits about wrestling history, you know, much like today, covering the career of Tracy Smothers. You know, I knew him almost all of my career, but I didn't know him all of his career. So I had to do tons of research and look into this. So this show can really be whatever we want it to be, and just keep that feedback coming, because you and I both, Conrad, we want this to be as good as possible. We want this to be different. Everybody's got a wrestling podcast, right? We want to contribute something to the overall good of professional wrestling, something that's timeless, something that people can look back on 5-10 years from now and enjoy just as much as they do when they listen to it now.
And you're going to get something for everybody, whether you were into WWE or you were into Japanese stuff or you were into indie stuff. I mean, there's not much that Chris doesn't know a lot about. So we're going to try to cover as much of that stuff as we can here. But let's talk about why we're here today. The wild-eyed Southern boy, Tracy Smothers himself. He was born September 2nd, 1962 in Springfield, Tennessee as Tracy Stanton Smothers. His father, Bob, was a Golden Gloves boxer and owned cattle. They had a bit of a cattle farm there and a car lot. So he's all about selling, baby. Tracy's mother was named Wanda, and he grew up with two older brothers, Jeff and Sammy, along with a younger sister named Allison. And his group of friends, Thugs, Thugs, which later is going to become a trademark of his. What can you tell us about Thugs, Chris?
T is for terrible, H is for hell, U is for ugly, and G is for jail, because a thug can't spell. Now, a lot of people know about the Thugs from his days in Smoky Mountain when he teamed with Dirty White Boy Tony Anthony. But he's so quick to tell everybody, like, man, the Thugs were real. Like, the Thugs were a real thing. When he grew up in Springfield, Tennessee, that area had a whole lot of cliques. He said that he wouldn't call them gangs, but, you had guys like Rose Hill, you had Greenbrier, you had Southtown, but then you also had the Southtown Rinky Dinks. You had the Goat Boys, who had a bit of a feud with the Thugs. These guys were characters. They were country boys. They played sports. They got into fights. They didn't do anything too crazy. But that's just a part of his childhood, a part of his youth that he loved, man. The Thugs, if you go back and listen to one of his shoot interviews, 2003 with Smart Mark Video, he goes down the names of the Thugs. You had guys like Peppy, Bow Wow. You had Jambo, Stick, you had Cockbite, you had a girl named Jen, we got Dab, we got Blockhead, we got Stud, and we got Big Stud, Chirp, Wild Dog, Bucky, Bino, who was named Bino because after he was born, his parents said there would be no more. You can tell that growing up this way would kind of form how Tracy would interact with people. He had nicknames for everybody, and he's just a good old country boy, wild-eyed Southern boy, Tracy Smothers.
What was Cars Creek Critter?
All right, so Carrs Creek was a creek in that area of Springfield, Tennessee, where there were talks of this animal. It was like a half wolf, half dog, half fox, something like that. That would feast on the livestock, and you can look up newspaper clippings, you can look up YouTube videos of people looking for this thing, and they'd stand on the bridges and they'd look for it and they'd listen for the howls. And the thing that I find funniest about this was when he signed his contract with WWF, he pitched the idea of himself being the Carrs Creek Critter.
Oh my God.
So I don't know how that would have played in the world of pro wrestling, but it's just such a funny thing from his real life that he tried to bring to the forefront. I guess in 96 WWF, anything's possible.
Before we talk about his professional career, he was the first person in Springfield high school history to go to the state championship in wrestling. What do you know about his amateur career?
Well, I know in high school, he played pretty much every sport. He played golf. He was in baseball. He was a talented amateur wrestler, but he was also a hell of a football player. He ended up getting a full scholarship to play for Carson Newman, where he wrestled and he was on the football team. And this is kind of where Tracy's life kind of takes a bit of a turn, because he wasn't doing so well with his grades. He wasn't super focused, and he got some injuries. He ended up probably with a number of concussions that were undiagnosed, because among all the positions that Tracy played, he was a wedge buster. He'd head off on those kickoffs and just ram into people as hard as humanly possible. So before he even took his first bump in pro wrestling, his concussion card was already stamped. He can get a free cone at Dairy Queen or something. He ended up transferring because he blew out his knee. He had a vertebrae in his neck that was messed up. He transferred over to Volunteer State and was playing a little bit there, and that's how he transitioned eventually into pro wrestling. He just his family did not love pro wrestling, and that was for the majority of his whole life. They always wanted him to come back home. They wanted him to be a football coach. And, the way that community was set up, he could have come back anytime and gotten a job as a coach, which he actually toyed with that idea quite a bit. But once you get into wrestling, it's in your blood. It's really hard to kick that habit. And I wouldn't say Tracy ever bragged about his accomplishments, but he was more than happy to tell stories of, his days playing football, his days wrestling. He was proud of those days. And I think his family not always being on board with pro wrestling did hurt him. But it didn't stop him from going after his love.
I think as a young man, Tracy used to pick strawberries and tobacco for a fellow named Mr. Perry. And I've heard over the years that he would hop in Mr. Perry's old pickup truck and head down to Nashville and watch the matches at the fairgrounds, which ironically enough, I think you even wrestled at for TNA back in the day. And at the time, Nick Goulas was the promoter, and Tracy's favorites as a young man were Bearcat Brown, Jackie Fargo, the Interns, and Tojo Yamamoto. Of course, in this area, because I'm in North Alabama, Jackie Fargo and Tojo Yamamoto are still talked about by old-time fans, and they made an impression on Tracy too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that he grew up watching Tojo, and then Tojo would basically become his secondary trainer and just gave him some beatings at those fairgrounds in Nashville all those years later. Tracy said that he would sneak off. He'd climb out his bedroom window and hop down and hop in the back of his pickup truck, Mr. Perry's. And, he said one time he went to the shows barefoot because he was just trying to get out of the house so quickly that he wouldn't get in trouble. And he and his buddies, and this carried on all the way up until college. Like, they would play wrestle with each other. They'd be like, "Oh, I'm Bearcat, you could be the fabulous Fargo, or we're both the Interns," or, whatever it was, just as kids do. But this carried all the way on to his college years when these different guys, Tracy, his knowledge of wrestling at that time was sheltered because he didn't get wrestling magazines. So he didn't know anything about the stars in the Northeast or out West. He didn't know who Bob Backlund was or Bruno Sammartino, but he sure knew who the Goulases were. He knew Tojo. And that's ended up how he broke into it. When he grew up, he would always he'd work out at the local gym, and he'd see Bill Dundee, you know, from the time he was an early teen. That's how he ended up meeting the Fabulous Ones, actually. And he knew they wrestled, but he never wanted to bug them about wrestling. So he'd just kind of go over and talk to them about working out. And eventually he found his way to Steve Keirn and Stan Lane. And at the time they were working the Memphis territory. So they were that loop would be Memphis, Tennessee. They'd head up to Louisville, Kentucky. They'd head over to Nashville, Tennessee. They do Evansville, Indiana as well. Those were the 4 main towns with all the little spot shows they would do in between. And at that time, Steve and Stan were working with guys. I wouldn't call it a wrestling school because those things didn't really exist back then,
right?
For the most part. But he, you know, hit it off with Steve Keirn, and Steve got in the ring with him a couple times, started taking him to shows, and you know, before you know it, he's out there having his first match.
Talk to me about the King Kong Bundy body slam challenge. I think Tracy had a story for that, huh?
Yeah, it's so wonderful. Again, when he was at Volunteer State, he and some of the guys went up to a local show, and they had the King Kong Bundy body slam challenge, where anybody from the crowd could come in and try to body slam King Kong Bundy. And I think this was where Tracy got his first taste of interacting with a crowd. Because he said he got in there, he got through the ropes, and then he's, going to the crowd and, hey man, go to hell, whatever he's doing. And he just felt really energized by this. And it came his turn to scoop King Kong Bundy, and he couldn't even get his foot up off the ground. It was, obviously, Bundy's 400 pounds at that time. But something that Tracy noticed is that one of his teammates went after he did and scooped up old Bundy and got his leg up and, kind of got him up off the mat for a second. And, he didn't understand at the time, but King Kong Bundy was just working,
right,
to try to get a reaction from the crowd. And that's something that stuck with him all those years later. Just a funny instance like that. And just gave him the first taste of having a live audience to interact with, and something that he cherished his entire career.
Well, if you really want to talk about the old stuff, how about the old tradition of wrestling bears? I got to hear this story from Tracy himself a few years ago. He didn't just wrestle a bear one time. He wrestled bears multiple times, and that seems make-believe, but once upon a time in the South, they would do things like these body slam challenges, or a fella's going to wrestle a bear. What can you tell us about Tracy and bears?
Tracy, so humble of a guy, right? He's never he'll tell you about his accomplishments, but not in a braggadocious way. But something I always got a kick out of is, everybody's seen that video on YouTube, and they hear the story of Tracy wrestling a bear, and they would, hey, Tracy, I heard you wrestled a bear. He was always so quick to go, I wrestled 3 bears.
Yes.
So he didn't just wrestle 1 bear, he wrestled 3 bears. The first one was Ginger, who was about 750 pounds at the time. And that was before he got into pro wrestling. It was just, they'd bring a bear around to bars. Sometimes they'd set up a ring and people would come in and wrestle the bear. They'd go like 7 or 8 people in a row. And he just really enjoyed this first experience. And the bear was tough, but he went 3 rounds with it, no problem. And then it was no problem, right? All these years later, he's working in Mid-South, right? And Tracy at this time didn't drink. He was always known for just having like a glass of orange juice with him at parties and hanging out. But he's sitting there with Chavo Guerrero Sr., sitting there with DJ Peterson, and they're just trying to hang out and talk to girls. And Nick Anderson's there. He's got a bear with him. He's got a 1,500-pound bear with him. And they're doing the challenge, get in, challenge the bear, et cetera, et cetera. And Tracy's watching this go on, and it's not like he's heckling, but he's like, you're getting too close to the bear. Like, don't make him mad. Like, what are you doing? And DJ and Chavo are kind of busting his balls. Like, what are you talking about? Like, why do you know so much about wrestling a bear? Right. So Tracy goes and he's talking to this blonde, and he's, trying to kick a little Tracy Smothers game to her. And then he just hears over the loudspeaker, all right, for our final combatant for the night is Tracy Smothers. So the guys had signed him up to wrestle this bear. Wow. And he's just like, guys, no, like I'm trying to do my deal. And sure enough, he gets in there, and this bear is massive, right? This is, twice the size of Ginger the bear. So he's, doing his bear techniques. You keep your distance from the bear. You don't get in too close with them because of how strong they are. You definitely don't do anything to piss the bear off, And this bear has a muzzle on him, so he can't do too much damage, you would think, right?
Right.
You've got Tracy pushed up against the ropes, just pushing the life out of Tracy. And just we'll talk about this a lot during the show, but Tracy had a very quick temper. So he headbutts this bear in the chest, right? And now the bear is just like, it's like clubbing him and scratching at him. And he's just like, get the damn bear off me, get the bear off, and he's the holder is like trying to like pull the bear, and Tracy's like throwing punches at it, and they finally get separated, right? And they're like, all right, cool. No big deal. And then this bear takes one last look at Tracy and lunges at him and swipes at him. Tracy tries to get out of the ring. He ends up jumping off the apron. He hits the floor and he shits his pants. So now he's at the bar to hang out and talk to girls, but his he shit his pants. He's got his clothes are in tatters, so in classic Tracy Smothers fashion, he goes back out to his car. He pulls out some sweatpants. He goes in the bathroom. He washes off. He changes, and he goes back to talk to that same girl, and she's already talking to one of the bouncers. So it's game over for Tracy Smothers that night. So that's just the second bear. The third bear was when he worked in Continental, and that's the one that you'll see on YouTube if you just put in Tracy Smothers bear, and it's magical, right? Gordon Soley's on commentary, and this bear was supposed to wrestle. I say wrestle like they booked it and they went over a finish. But it's Wildcat Wendell Cooley, right? Who's doing an angle with Dutch Mantel at the time. Wendell's got an injury, so Tracy's just like, hell yeah, I'll wrestle a bear, whatever, right? So not only does he have to wrestle a bear, he's also working a tag program with Steve as the Southern Boys. So 3 nights in a row on this loop, he wrestles 3 matches a night. He wrestles the tag match with Steve. He goes and he wrestles the bear, who's managed by Dutch Mantel. Then he has a singles with Dutch Mantel, 3 nights in a row. And if you haven't already seen this, I recommend you to go look it up, because I have never seen it in my life, but Tracy Smothers leapfrogs the damn bear. He's got him backed into a corner. He hops up in the second rope and leapfrogs him. Tracy even told me that during this loop that he would try to get somebody at ringside with him that would hop up on the apron and draw the bear so he could attack it. Like, hey man, draw the bear. And the bear like look over and he just go, ah. Is that not unhinged? What a crazy man.
He is one of the craziest people I've ever met in professional wrestling. And if you grew up in the South, you eventually in that era made your way through Memphis. So tell me some Jerry Jarrett stuff. I'm sure Tracy had some interactions with Jerry along the way.
Yeah. Obviously he knew who Jerry Jarrett was because of the matches. But like we said earlier, Tracy's dad had a car lot. And there was a time where Jerry Jarrett wanted to purchase another car lot, and he was going to have Tracy's dad, Bob, run the thing. So there was a bit of a connection there. It wasn't until, like I mentioned earlier, that he met Stan and Steve that he started to go and train and get in the ring a little bit. And it's really hard to say how much actual training he did have before his first match, but Stan and Steve were very good to him, and they took him on the road. And at this time, Tracy was working a job packing trucks, and his boss was like such a cool guy because Tracy worked so hard. I mean, anybody that knows Tracy, hardest working man in the business, right? So he would work this job and stack these boxes, and all he needed was like 30 minutes of notice, and he could tell his boss, and he'd head off to the town for his loop. And he did that for years before he was a full-time wrestler.
Let's do a little bit of discussion about the fabulous ones. I don't know that everybody really appreciates what their impact or influence was on pro wrestling, but I feel like you're pretty qualified to share some of that.
Yeah, I think when people hear the fabulous ones, they think of those music videos that they used to do where it's Stan and Steve, bare chested, posing. They've got the top hats. You got Sharp Dressed Man playing. Well, this came from fabulous Jackie Fargo. He was just such a huge star. It's really hard for people to comprehend now, because with the explosion of WWF in the 80s, all of these characters were so big and larger than life. Going into the 90s, you have all these huge muscled up people that people think that that's what wrestlers look like, right? Obviously now that's kind of been exposed through Ultimate Fighting and how a guy looks. It doesn't matter quite what he looks like. He has to have something in the tank for him to do any damage. So you take a look at Jackie Fargo through today's eyes, and you wouldn't think much of him, but he was so popular and he just had such fire. He would have great comebacks. The Ric Flair strut, right? That comes from the fabulous Jackie Fargo. That was the Fargo strut, which Jeff Jarrett took. And people think Jeff Jarrett is ripping off Ric Flair when he's actually, like his uncle, he would say, is Jackie Fargo, through the wrestling business. So they took that gimmick and they gave it to Steve Kern and Stan Lane and had them be the fabulous ones. And they were like the proteges of Jackie Fargo. And it actually worked, man. They became huge stars, huge draws. You look at those videos of them, just all the glamour with that, you wouldn't think that they would be believable contenders to the Road Warriors, but they had matches all over, from Puerto Rico to working for Vern to like we said, the Memphis territory, and they held their own, these two pretty boys that you wouldn't think much of, but they could fight. And that they tried that time and time again with, they came back with the Fantastics, right? And then you had the Fantastic Ones, which was Bobby Fulton and Terry Taylor. They tried that very briefly, but it happens in wrestling where you don't always strike lightning. Lightning doesn't always strike twice, right? You try to recapture certain things and it doesn't always work the same way, but the Fabulous Ones absolutely worked as a tag team.
Tell us about Tracy's first match.
So Tracy did not have wrestling gear because he had only been training a couple times. They called him up. Hey man, you feel like having a match today? He hopped in the car. They were in Columbia, Kentucky. Steve let him borrow a singlet, right? But it was too big for Tracy. So, Tracy's out there. He's in the ring waiting for his opponent to come to the ring. The referee for the match is Paul, is Ricky Morton's dad, which is a cool little bit of trivia.
Yep.
And his singlet straps, keep fumbling to the side. So they would rib him mercilessly about, hey man, don't let Lawler see you taking your straps down, man. That's his gimmick, and Tracy's just so good-hearted that he's just like, oh man, I'm trying, whatever. He's already insecure about what he's wearing. But his opponent for that night was Conga the Barbarian, which would be Barbarian of the Powers of Pain or Faces of Fear. He had been in the gym with the Barbarian before, and he saw this man, doing, 500 and 600 pounds, military press, incline bench, regular bench. And he's just like, oh my God, this guy is a monster. And now he's in the ring and here comes Conga the Barbarian. And Tracy didn't know how to work yet. So the match was not very good. And if you'd ask him about it, he would just say, man, it was rotten, man. He tried to work with me, man. He really did. But, Tracy didn't know enough by that time to do much aside from getting his ass beat.
We know another Tennessee legend, Gypsy Joe. He's very much a Tennessee legend. Did Tracy have any stories or interactions with Joe over the years?
Yeah, Joe was around the Nashville territory at the time, and had a friendship, maybe even a bit of a partnership with Tojo Yamamoto. And they took Tracy in. The Fabulous Ones had some beef with Lawler and they left the territory. They ended up going to work for Vern Gagne and AWA. And that kind of left Tracy, without his guys. He didn't have guys to ride to the shows with. He didn't know enough people yet to just start showing up. So he had gotten in with Gypsy Joe and Tojo. They named him Steve Lane, half of Stan Lane, half of Steve Kern. So that was his name for a little while. And Joe, Joe was a part of his career, most of his life. I was on several shows with the two of them together, and they just had a good relationship together. Tojo was a guy that was very old school, and old school in the way that if you broke someone into the business, you would push them to their absolute physical and emotional limits. So he would have Tracy on these Sunday sessions. They'd train at the fairgrounds from 10 to 4. So that's 6 full hours of training, which is way too much. And these other guys that were training were not smartened up to the business. Wow. So poor Tracy's in there trying to wrestle these guys, and these guys are wrestling for real. And he's blowing himself up, and hours and hours of this training. And at the end of the training, he'd make them run all the steps all the way up to the top, and he'd have them get on their knees, and Tojo would have this kendo stick, and he would just blast them across the chest 10 times, which sucks, right? You're just sitting there, and this old man is caning the shit out of you. And the thing that was rough for Tracy is because he was a pro, Tojo was even harder on him. Tojo would make Tracy do twice as much as the other guys. So if they're getting lashed across the chest 10 times, Tracy's getting it 20 times. And he would just, whenever he would talk about this time of his training, he would just be like, man, you'd go to jail for that now. But those are just the things, especially back then, that guys would do to get into the business. You've heard how many stories on shoot interviews about guys getting their legs broken or getting their Achilles crushed. But that was just the time of the business, and it was too barbaric. Absolutely. But it's, just kind of the state of the game at that era.
Well, another thing that was interesting about Tennessee in this era, besides characters like Tojo and Gypsy Joe, there's another guy who's going to become a real big star out of this area, the Macho Man, Randy Savage. Any chance before Macho hit it big in New York, he had any interaction with Tracy?
Yeah. 1985, probably, I think this was about May, Tracy got to wrestle Randy on television, and he had worked with his brother Lanny several times in Memphis. But this was, I think, Macho Man goes to WWF in June or July. So this is right before his big run. And up until this point, this is the best match Tracy has had. And when I say best, I just mean he came out of it feeling the best. When you're so young and you haven't quite gotten comfortable with what you're doing in pro wrestling, it's just it's hard to enjoy yourself in that moment. But when he was in there with Randy's throwing him all over the place. Tracy's fighting back, and he knew that Randy was leaving the territory. So after the match, he goes up to him and he's like, hey man, before you go, I just wanted to thank you, man. That was great. And Randy just stops and looks at him, and he's just like, don't ever think a man that suplexed you on the floor. It was a fun little one that Tracy would tell you. And Tracy would go on to suplex many men on the floor in that era. And I think, that was probably the biggest name he had a competitive match with. I mean, of course, the year prior, he was on those Pro Wrestling USA TV tapings that they ran, which was basically, oh my gosh, it was Crockett's and Vern and Lawler and Jarrett. They were trying to combine to go up against WWF or just to combat WWF. So I've just seen this footage recently, which is why it's fresh in my memory, but Tracy had some enhancement matches on those. He wrestled the Road Warriors, right? Wow. Young Tracy Smothers. It's so different to watch because he's just not comfortable in the ring yet. He's just getting beat up. He gets thrown off. Animal clotheslines the shit out of him and pins him. He has a tag match, which is incredible to look back on. It's against Harley Race and Dory Funk Jr.
Wow.
And then he's got like a 1-minute squash where he gets destroyed with a Saito suplex by Masa Saito. And looking back on this, the coolest thing for me watching this is that Terry Funk's on commentary.
Oh, wow.
And Terry's even like, this young Tracy Smothers, he's got a good future in the business. He's in good shape. He's a good size. And that was very cool to see that, knowing how much Tracy looked up to Terry, and then the chance that they got to work a couple different times over the years.
That whole USA or Pro Wrestling USA thing, man, that seemed like such a great idea on paper, but I guess egos of promoters, it just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah. And you just really have to be patient, right? You know, they drew some really good houses and they had some great talent, but how do you get everybody on the same page? It's difficult.
Very difficult. Let's talk about, he's working in the CWA before jumping to Mid-South. As you mentioned, he's mostly being used as an enhancement talent. Who's he learning from at this point when he's sort of in the early developmental stages of his career?
He said that he had learned quite a bit from guys like Rick Rude. He said Jackie Fargo was a guy that was always telling him, like, you need more fire, you need more fire. And Tracy's like, man, I am working 9 hours and I'm driving 2 hours to the show. I'm, you know, sleeping like 4 hours a night and in 15-minute increments throughout the day. It's hard to have fire. It's hard to have energy, but he eventually fought through that. Jay Youngblood was a guy that was very helpful to him. Steve-O, just a lot of different people that he had crossed paths with. It was Bill Dundee that sent Tracy to Mid-South to work for Bill Watts. And that was when Tracy started to work wrestling full time for the first time. And gosh, that locker room was way different, right? You know, you had Bill Watts's style of wrestling and Dr. Death, you had DiBiase, you had Jake Roberts, you had a lot of those guys. He started being on shows with Dick Murdoch, Dick Slater. And this is interesting. I can even talk about this a bit later, but one thing that Tracy told me that I thought was really cool is that when he was young in wrestling and he was coming up, he said the two people that he tried to emulate were Dick Slater and Jack Briscoe. He said he wanted to be like Dick Slater because he knew that he could fight, and he wanted to be like Jack Briscoe because he knew he could wrestle.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until he told me that I could see both of those guys' styles and his, and, you know, kind of the way he is like shooting around with people in the beginning and feeling them out and doing like the Oklahoma roll. And then also the kind of brawling that he would do is very similar to Dick Slater's kind of hard-nosed style.
Let's talk a little bit about Memphis again before we move on. It's almost a rite of passage. At some point, if you wrestle long enough in Memphis, you're going to be involved in some fantastic angles and moments. And one of those happens when I think Tracy got a fireball to the face.
Yeah,
right?
He was working with an older tag team. These two guys, Roger Smith and Don Bass, they were called Fire and Flame. And Tracy was just kind of fodder up until this point. And he teamed with Tojo, but then Tojo turned on him. And then, like I said, now he's in this angle. He's getting a fireball in his face. And what Tracy said about that era is it was very hard to be a wrestler living in Tennessee or coming up in Tennessee and to get looked at by a Jerry Jarrett or a Jerry Lawler, because they just, those Tennessee guys were everywhere. They had tons of them, right? So they would always bring in talent to push from different territories. So it wasn't until Jerry Lawler had seen him take this massive fireball and was like, oh man, that looked great. Like he called up Tracy, said, hey, we're going to bring you to, Mid-South Coliseum on Monday night. We want you to, we'll get you all bandaged up. We'll have you sit in the crowd and we'll just keep that angle going and we'll do some TV stuff. And that was when he got on and started to get the respect of the guys there, that he's more than just a local. He's a guy that actually has something special. You have Lance Russell putting him over on commentary and talking about how, what a fighter he is and what a wholesome young man he is. He's got him in there, teaming with guys like Pat Tanaka and Paul Diamond. This is where Tracy really learns to work, I think, just doing these angles and having these short TV matches. And then the match finishes and then you roll over to the booth with Lance Russell and you go and you cut a promo. This is where I think he starts to get that foundation under him to become the pro wrestler that he would become.
Well, it's the dying days of the territories, but we're not done yet. He even had a brief stint in Florida, right?
Yeah, it was, I think, Pat Tanaka that put him in touch with Kevin Sullivan, and Kevin was the booker of Championship Wrestling from Florida at that time, and said, hey man, why don't we put you and Steve Armstrong together? We'll call you the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys. We'll do the Rebel Flag gimmick, et cetera, et cetera. And he had known Steve. He was pretty acclimated to working with the Armstrongs. You know, he really thought the world of Bob Armstrong and just said, hey, what the hell? This is a good opportunity. Let's try this. And actually down there in Florida, you know, they come in, they start working with the New Breed right away, which is a very funny tag team to look back on. It was Chris Champion and dude, why am I blanking on this right now? Who's Chris Champion's partner? Sean Royal. There we go. Even the wrestling genius has a slip up now and again. But they came from the future, right? So they have all these funny promos. It's a really cool thing. It was short-lived, but it's fun to look back on those promos. They work with the New Breed, but then they get their first opportunity to wrestle the Midnight Express. And that, I don't know if that was where he met Jim Cornette for the first time, but Tracy and Jim really hit it off, and Jim would be a big part of his career for years to come. Also, a cool thing about wrestling in Florida, Tracy got to be on shows with Bruiser Brody.
Oh, wow.
He talks about this one time where they brought in Bruiser Brody. Unfortunately, the Florida territory was a bit suffering because they had the Brody Luger cage debacle right before they came in. But on one of the shows Tracy worked, the main event was Bruiser Brody against the Sheik. So he said he got to, you know, climb all the way up to, you know, the top area, like on the balcony, and just watch this chaos unfold before him. And he just, that's a theme of Tracy's career. He would go out there, and now that I put it together, this is something that Steve Kern always conveyed to me when I would train with him at Florida Championship Wrestling. It's very important to go out there and watch some of the show.
Yeah.
Right? You can't just sit in the locker room all day and just hope that everything is going to go awesome when you have your match. Yes, you can, but you can better prepare yourself by taking a poke out, seeing what the crowd looks like, seeing how they're reacting to things, and then also seeing a little bit of the match of what these guys are doing. You don't want to go out there the very next match and do the same damn spots. I mean, we see it all the time. Guys are so focused on, maybe focused isn't the right word. The guys want to go out and have the best match they can. So they spend their time putting that match together and making sure it's perfect, when you could make your match even better by getting a gauge of how the crowd's going to react to something by watching a little bit of it. So Tracy would always poke his head out through the curtain or find a chair somewhere inconspicuous to watch the matches. And that Brody Sheik match, as you could imagine, was crazy.
Talk to me about when he's first on your radar. I mean, you're from Ohio, so you're not exactly catching Memphis TV, are you? Or are you seeing Florida stuff, or just from the magazines? Or when is Tracy first on your radar as a young fan?
So I didn't start watching wrestling myself until 1989, January of 89. So I think I knew wrestling existed, but I just didn't quite understand the world of it.
Right.
So it would have been when he and Steve came to WCW as the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys. That would have been my first time seeing him. And then I just remember being so confused when, like, all of a sudden they were the Young Pistols. I didn't understand what or why that was. But I knew there was Brad Armstrong. I knew that there was a Bullet Bob Armstrong. So I would get magazines from garage sales or flea markets, or, you know, because they had so many different magazines back in the day that I would obviously be getting what was the newsstand, but I'd also be getting these old magazines that you could kind of flip through and see who was around. Yeah, it wasn't until he came to WCW that I found out who Tracy was. I
don't think he actually debuts with WCW until 1990. Let's talk about what he did on the way there. He ultimately leaves Florida, I think, over a pay dispute. He winds up back in the CWA Continental just very briefly, but then somehow gets to go do a tour of New Japan. And I think he even wrestled some in Mexico before he landed in WCW. You know, when guys from over there come over here, they call it excursion. What was Tracy's interest in Japan or Mexico, and how did this all come to be?
So Tracy was excellent at networking, and he was such a locker room favorite. And this is just in my days with him. Everybody loved Tracy, and he would always go out of his way to help people. So that came from his younger days when people went out of their way to help him. Like I said, Pat Tanaka got him into Florida, and then through working in Florida, he met Hiro Matsuda, who suggested New Japan book him. So he goes over there and he works some tours for New Japan. He does some with Steve, but then he also does some by himself. That's where he got to be pretty good friends with Owen Hart. I recently even saw a singles match that Tracy had with Antonio Inoki, which is incredible.
Wow.
And just the quality of this match was awful. Right. But it was really awesome to see Tracy just get on him from the bell ring, and like, he wouldn't give him any space. He, wouldn't let him fire. Tracy was just really taking it to him. And Inoki ended up finishing the match with like this sick little spin kick. It's just a fun little 6-7 minute house show match. Then it was Vader. He met Vader working for New Japan, and Vader's the one that hooked him up with UWA in Mexico, which they went down just very briefly. Again, he went with Steve, but then he also went solo by himself. And it's hilarious if you see this picture. He's on the cover of Boxy Lucha, which is their weekly wrestling magazine down in Mexico. They are the Southern boys. They're Los Southern boys, right? And they have Rebel Flag masks, and they're Southern Boy 1 and 2.
Wow.
So it's just a funny little dynamic there. Tracy has this story of being in a 6-man with, he worked with guys like the Brazos. He worked with the Vianos. He is in a match opposite this guy named Fishman. And the crowd is super rowdy, and, they're on their way to the back, and, the wrestlers are kind of fighting the fans a little bit, pushing and shoving, and they get to the back and they're like, oh my God, that was good. Fishman left his necklace ringside, and I don't know if it had sentimental value or what, but Fishman's like, all right, man, I'm going to go get my necklace. So he goes back out, and immediately he gets swarmed, and people are swiping on him and grabbing him and kind of hitting at him. So Tracy goes out there to save the guy that he just spent the last 20 minutes beating his ass. Wow. So now Tracy's there with Fishman, and they're helping fighting the fans off. Fishman gets his necklace. They go back to the back. And that's just, I don't want to say Tracy ever went looking for confrontation, but he would never back down. He was just always ready to defend whoever he had to. He was very territorial when it came to the business and the people he loved and cared about in the business. He would go to war with you in a heartbeat. But you always hear about those wrestling riots, and Tracy was in a number of those over the years.
Well, let's talk about his big break. When he lands in WCW, it's April 23rd, 1990. He's coming in as a tag team partner with Steve Armstrong. You mentioned, we knew him as the Wild-Eyed Southern Boys. Eventually they become the Young Pistols. I'm curious, though, what do you think his aspirations in wrestling were? I think a lot of people listening to this who may just be not super familiar with wrestling outside of the WWE, they probably assume everyone's goal is to work for WWE, but lots of guys have much different goals in wrestling, and they came up in a different style of wrestling. And sure, everyone wants to make the most money possible, but they also really enjoy what they do. And that's not always conducive, working in the WWE or WWF back then. Was Tracy excited to go work for a major promotion like WCW, or was that even something really in his purview?
Tracy was a guy that never did it for the money, but you better believe that he noticed the check that he got from WCW. He's like, man, this is more money I made in my life.
Right.
So it was just kind of a win-win situation. He wanted another thing that Tracy would always joke about. He'd be like, man, I got to get a job to support my wrestling habit.
Yeah.
So it was never about the money. He was going to wrestle no matter what. So I think it was just a bonus for him to get to travel all these places and benefit from it financially. And I think we've talked about these different places. We talked about Memphis. We talked about Continental, Mid-South, Florida, New Japan, working in Mexico. This built a foundation in Tracy that led to him just having such reverence for the different styles of pro wrestling. And just, he's a guy that would never shit on a guy for doing something different than he would do it.
So let's talk about WCW. He met Vader over in Japan. He's also become friendly with Jim Cornette. Would Jim Cornette have been a big proponent of getting Tracy in, or how do you think that all went down?
Yeah, I think so. I think Jim championed Tracy to anybody that would listen. And I think also Jim was a fan of the gimmick and thought, it would make some good money. Tracy, like we said earlier, there was a bit of a dispute over money when he worked in Florida. They wanted them to go into a program up in mid-Atlantic with the Crockett's, with the Midnights, and they bailed out on it. And I think there was some fear that Dusty would have a little resentment towards Tracy and Steve, but they were able to smooth things over and just didn't, just wanted to have some good business and bring in a new hot tag team. And it's crazy to see how over they were immediately. You look back at those matches with the Freebirds or with the Midnights or whatever, they were very popular for just a team that really didn't have any equity built up yet.
We're going to talk about my favorite match, one of my favorite matches ever, in just a moment. But their first TV appearance, and when I say they, of course, I mean Tracy and Steve, is a win over Kevin Sullivan and Cactus Jack by DQ. And a week later, they upset the United States Tag Team Champions, the Midnight Express, in a non-title match. Boy, to come in and get this sort of TV time and recognition so early, the office had to be high on them, or the boys, or both.
Yeah, I think so. I think they really wanted to do some good business with those guys, and that's what you do. You bring in a team and you establish them right away as a threat. And imagine that, right? Imagine bringing someone in and putting them over right away.
We don't see it on TV very often these days.
It's tough. Philosophies change over the years. Something that I thought was cool about the Kevin Sullivan Cactus Jack match, right? Like Mick is a guy whose path crossed with Tracy's all over the place. They saw each other in Continental. They saw each other, as we're saying right now, in WCW. They worked together in Japan. They were, they both worked ECW. Then you see them in, Tracy's first match on Raw was against Mankind. So it's just a cool thread that you see throughout Tracy's career, that Mick Foley's there a lot of those places. And Kevin Sullivan is the one that came up with the damn gimmick for the Southern Boys. And now he's a couple territories later, a couple years later, he's wrestling these guys in WCW. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's remarkable. They get a big win over the fabulous Freebirds at Clash of the Champions 11. They're on a roll, man. But I can't help but wonder, when you come in and you're getting this big push, and supposedly the office has you pegged as, their new favorites, that has to rub some of these guys the wrong way on the existing roster. And well, there are a lot of politics involved in WCW in this era. Did you ever hear any stories from Tracy about politics in WCW when he first came up?
Politics are something that kind of were a factor in a couple different parts of Tracy's career. And he would always encourage people to try not to piss anybody off too badly, because the one person that you piss off here may be the person that's in charge of your career over here. I don't know of a lot of specifics with WCW. I know that he enjoyed his time there, but I do know that there are certain people throughout the years that, Tracy either had a short temper, or he was maybe a little too outspoken in different places, and his career would end up suffering because of it. But you can't deny the crowd's response for these guys. Something very cool in that match that you mentioned earlier with the Midnights. It's at the Bash. The fans go into this just wanting to love the Midnight Express so badly, which they're the heels. But in certain territories, that the Midnights were just super over because they were such a cool tag team, with their presentation, but then also the way they would work, the things they would do. But if you notice this match, the fans start out going one way, and then Stan Lane and Tracy go to this ridiculous karate spot where they're like holding back fists, which Tracy would do throughout the years with different people. But the fans loved this, and it completely turned the tide, and it got the fans going where they needed to go for the match they were going to have. And this is a match I've recommended recently to current tag teams to watch, just because the structure is very different. We get so used to doing things the same way because it's a tried and true method. You're like, okay, we do this to get this, etc. But there are historic instances where different structures work, and it's up to us to take it upon ourselves to try to change things up every now and again. And this match is a perfect example of that.
I think it's maybe my favorite tag match ever. And when Tracy passed away, your old pal CM Punk actually took to Twitter and recommended everyone go watch it. And he referred to it as the greatest tag match of all time. Obviously, that's subjective, but at this point, I think we can all agree this is Tracy's best match and most high profile match.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was just the perfect storm, a partner he had a lot of chemistry with, one of the hottest tag teams of all time. Obviously, you have Cornette there, and then they're also, they're not oversaturated in this company yet. They're a new thing. So it's not a match that you've seen a million times. So it's just something new and exciting for the fans. And it was just an awesome match. I highly recommend everybody check it out.
Fast forward to the new year, and in January of 91, they're renamed the Young Pistols, and then they're going to turn heel at the end of the year. What do you think of the name and the switch? I mean, is this just we're trying to get away from Southern? We're trying to drop the rebel flag deal? Why the switch to the Young Pistols?
Yeah, I think there were some executives in Atlanta through TBS that just wanted to completely stray away from that. And looking back on it, you can go, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Right. But man, especially in today's climate with, how racially charged the rebel flag has become. When I say become, I mean, like I grew up and you would see the Dukes of Hazzard on TV.
That's right.
So as a kid, I didn't understand the weight of that symbol. I didn't understand it. And then I think there's a lot of people that are still having issues with that, but it was a smart move to change it, but it was not a smart move to pretend that all of a sudden these guys are from Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming. All due respect to the people in Cheyenne, Wyoming, as Tracy would say later in his career. I don't know if this gimmick was based on the movie Young Guns, which was a super popular movie in that era with a whole lot of, a big blockbuster there, right? But it just was not, I don't know. It was not it, as they often say. So now you've got these guys who have been building momentum, and then all of a sudden they've got a name switch, which wasn't really explained. I mean, maybe if they would have done some vignettes and kind of explained, like when Tito Santana became El Matador, maybe at least we'd have something to look back on and laugh, right? But the fans kind of started to turn on them in certain places, and then this led to them actually turning heel. And some of the funniest Tracy Smothers facial hair you'll ever see. Like he starts to kind of grow in this beard. Just a different era for his career. Steve was doing musician stuff at the time and then had a bit of a fallout with WCW. And then that leaves Tracy on his own. He was a Southern boy. Now he's a young pistol. Now he's a singles guy. So even though he was respected as a performer, he just didn't have a lot of equity or credibility as any type of a draw. So he was, a carpenter there. He was in there to get people through good matches. And it really kind of changed the trajectory of his career.
Before we talk about him leaving, I do want to mention he does have a U.S. tag team title run. We talked earlier that they actually had a win over the U.S. tag champs, the Midnight Express, but it was non-title. But they do finally beat the Patriots, which is Firebreaker Chip and Todd Champion. They would drop those belts to Ron Simmons and Big Josh, which in hindsight, what a weird pairing that is. But they did a little stop and start with them. So it's unfortunate they did the name change. I'm with you. I like the original presentation better, but I understand it. But it feels like they lose a little steam. Even with the tag run, it doesn't feel like they're able to pull the nose up. But once he's working by himself, I guess we should add some context to this. Steve leaves in April of 92. So Tracy's going to work singles until September of 92. He had a very short program with Johnny B. Bad, who was the apple of Dusty's eye in this era. But Jim Cornette has now quit following Halloween Havoc back in 1990. And he's taken a little bit of time and gotten together Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And this feels like an old school territory. And knowing Cornette was a big fan of Tracy's, it feels like a no-brainer that he probably reached out and said, Tracy, how much longer are you going to do that? And made the pitch. But I just made that up. What really happened? How did he wind up leaving WCW to go work with Smoky Mountain?
Yeah, the second Jim started Smoky Mountain, Tracy was one of the guys he had in mind because he had faith in Tracy as a performer and not just as a part of an act in a tag team. Like he knew what Tracy was capable of. And you would see that when he finally did decide to make the move over to Smoky Mountain. I think, if you look at his storied career and he went so many different places and did so many things, I think the purest Tracy Smothers work is in Smoky Mountain. He came in right off the bat. He was a strong featured baby face. He just had you look back, there's a lot of house shows that are available, Smoky Mountain, but then you also have the TV episodes. It's just really cool to see the connection that he had with that crowd. When they brought him in, they did this sit down interview with Tracy. And I don't remember seeing anything like this before in Tracy's career, because Tracy's promos were very much of that era where it's, Saturday night, when I get my hands on you, I'm going to that kind of thing. Right. This was Tracy sitting on a porch swing with an airbrushed by the grace of God, Southern by the grace of God, whatever on his shirt. And he just talks people through the last few years of his career, because what he had done in WCW, especially that last year or so, had damaged his credibility as a draw, I would say. And this promo, this little video that they did of him, was exceptional in just rebuilding him and rehabilitating him as a performer. He explains that, he was riding high, and he had a conversation with Bob Armstrong that said, listen, you got a lot of people supporting you right now, but just make sure those same people are supporting you when things aren't so good. So then, he had the ups and downs. They turned to the Young Pistols. Fans kind of started to turn on them. They eventually turned heel. Then he was by himself, and he's just kind of floundering a little bit. So he used this real life thing that happened, which was a mix of his TV character, but then also how he was being featured. And he just turned it into this realistic promo where he's like, listen, I want to prove myself. I want to show everybody what I do have. Maybe they didn't like the country boy in the big cities, but I'm the guy for you. And Jim proceeded to put him in programs with like Dirty White Boy. He won the Beat the Champ TV television championship almost right away. And a little tidbit there, that was in 1992. And before watching this, I didn't realize he was practically in a four corners match or a four-way dance, and he eliminated all three guys. And when I think of four-way matches, I think of the phenomena starting with ECW's three-way dance, and then WWE picking up on it and always having all these scramble matches throughout the years. But I don't think of a four-way dance happening in 1992, but it happened. Jim Cornette booked it, and what a way to put Tracy over strong. Jim thought the world of him, and you could tell by the way that he booked Tracy.
One of his first big feuds is against the Dirty White Boy, Tony Anthony. And Dirty White Boy, Tony Anthony had been a staple in Southern wrestling for a long time, even back in Continental, and his famous angle with Dr. Tom. But eventually they have a feud that involves the Smoky Mountain Championship. What did you think of the Tracy Tony Anthony program?
So a funny little personal side story is that I was once booked to wrestle Tony Anthony in Knoxville, Tennessee for Ron's Championship Wrestling. And it's called Ron's Championship Wrestling because Ron owned a car dealership, and he was back in this local company that ran shows. I did do the show. Tony ran the locker room and did not wrestle. But just a funny little tidbit that I almost had a match with TL Hopper from mid-90s WWF.
Fantastic.
Tony is just such a when you think of Southern wrestler, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, like, he's just an ass kicker. He's a shit talker. It's just the perfect program for Tracy to get out there with. And at the time, Tony was accompanied by this Tennessee wrestling legend, Ron Wright. And Ron was, he was in a wheelchair at the time to get a little extra heat. And it is incredible. They did this angle where they had a match, and Tracy's draped over the ropes and the ref is distracted, and Ron Wright gets up out of the wheelchair and blasts him. And it's just such a funny moment to see everybody lose their shit that the guy was faking being in a wheelchair. But they also do this angle where Tony handcuffs Tracy to the ropes, and he brings his flag into the ring, and he sets it on fire in the middle of the ring in a trash can. And he's the heel. He's burning a rebel flag, and he's a heel in this situation. It's just very sobering to kind of look back on and be like, oh my gosh, it's so strange just to look back on this and see the heel burning a Confederate flag, the babyface's Confederate flag, no less, and just the fans just getting so angry. It's just a capsule of the time to kind of look back on. And they the thing that brings this full circle is, we'll get to it in a second, but he does form a tag team with Tony Anthony later on as the Thugs. So it just epitomizes all the different things that Tracy was able to do with those crowds. It was incredible.
We know that he's going to also run into a fella down there named Candido. And they work a program with ladder matches around the same time that Razor and Shawn are doing a ladder match at WrestleMania 10. I'm sure you've seen all of those ladder matches. What was better, in your opinion?
It's hard to say which is better because they're different.
Right.
And the Shawn Razor ones especially ended on such a big stage. But there's a certain charm to seeing these house show, these, fan cam shots of Chris Candido pulling out like a 4.5 foot ladder, and, like a wooden ladder, and, trying to go up and grab whatever it is they're trying to grab. But these matches were brutal. These guys, Candido is a guy that was, I don't want to say he was floundering, but he didn't have a lot of credibility as like an actual threat. He had done some comedy stuff. He had done some like baby bonnet or diaper matches or whatever you want to call it. But Tracy, he's a guy that Tracy really respected and thought he was awesome. And Candido's, 22, 23 at the time. So, one day Tracy's like, hey man, why don't you guys let me work with this guy, So they had these programs. They end up doing these ladder matches, like you said, at the very same time. And they're great to watch in hindsight. At one point, these guys are having all these ladder matches. Over a less than a month period, they had 10 ladder matches. They had 8 ladder matches in the span of 12 days. Can you imagine the toll that takes on your body? Right. No. And the big one, you've got Brian Hildebrand refereeing, and they've got this ladder, and they're going back and forth on the ladder, and they're fighting back and forth, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then finally he goes to bip Candido off, and the ladder buckles. And the problem with this, not only the danger of them falling with no control whatsoever, is that they only have one ladder.
Yeah.
So this ladder, it is terrifying to watch it snap out from under them. They both take these bumps, but Tracy knows the finish is coming. So he picks up the broken ladder and sets it up. And, he says over to Mark Hildebrand, he used to call him Gerbil, he's like, hey, Gerbil, you got to hold this, So 120-pound Mark Curtis is tasked with the responsibility of another human's safety. So he is holding onto this ladder for dear life. You see Candido get up, and he kind of falls back into the corner to kind of observe, how this is going to go. The ladder's already broken on once. And I will be damned if Tracy Smothers does not scale this ladder. He grabs the gimmick off the top of it, and just at the right moment, Candido lunges at him. He jumps off the ladder, and it is absolutely perfect, with a ladder that is snapped, that's broken, and just the charm of, we're so used to ladder matches from the TLC era, but this is just this rickety old ladder. And, 2 of the most unheralded wrestlers in the history of professional wrestling are just going out there and having a spectacle. And although many things went wrong, they were able to just nail it like true professionals. Just a really awesome thing. Another Smoky Mountain bit I wanted to mention before I forgot about it. Very easy thing to do on these spot shows is a battle royal.
That's right.
Right. You get the excitement of just all these different people making their entrances. It's not crazy hard work for the guys. It's a way to get some extra people onto the show. And just, especially if you're like a younger kid or just an older fan, it's just exciting to see all these guys in the ring at once. So Jim booked these battle royals on a lot of spot shows, and going through the cage match results for Tracy's career, this man won 26 battle royals. Like that, it's not quite Andre the Giant, but it is fascinating that just Tracy was the guy that Jim picked. Like, listen, we're going to send the fans home happy. Let's get Tracy Smothers to win this damn battle royal. And that's something I had never even thought of. But, there's likely more, as the results on Cage Match aren't comprehensive, but it's just very cool to see that the king of the battle royals, Tracy Smothers, had won at least 26 battle royals throughout his couple years with Smoky Mountain Wrestling.
Let's talk about him going back over to Japan. We mentioned earlier that he had a little stint with New Japan, but when he's going to go back here in the mid-90s, well, it's not exactly working for New Japan. He tries something totally different. Tell us about it.
Yeah, he goes over for Wing, which was mostly a hardcore promotion. It was, booked by Victor Quinones. The cool thing about this is Tracy was so well liked and well regarded that in a time where it was somewhat taboo to switch back and forth between promotions in Japan without getting heat, guys would jump back and forth, but that would, they'd be screwing a promoter over. In the same year, Tracy worked for Wing, right? Then once that was done, Wing had closed. He went over through Stan Hansen and got booked for All Japan. And then he did tours there where he teamed with Dr. Death. He wrestled all of the pillars, Misawa, Kobashi, Kawada, Taue. He worked with a lot of those guys. He worked with Giant Baba. And then he ends up going over and working for IWA Japan, which had, Quinones as well, just parts of it. So Tracy worked for New Japan, All Japan, Wing, IWA Japan. He did tours for Big Japan. He worked for FMW, and he even went over in the last few years of his career for various people. So he just had such good relationships with people that he was able to just kind of do all of that. A fun little story I'd like to tell that I have just found out about recently. On one of the last shows for Wing, I believe, you had Jason the Terrible, which was a wrestler from Puerto Rico. He trained with Johnny Rods. I believe his name was Raphael. He was wrestling Freddy Krueger, which was Doug Gilbert. And Jason the Terrible had gotten some heat with Victor Quinones. And Victor was having a loser leaves match with him and wanted him shit canned out of the company. So he booked Tracy as the new Jason the Terrible. But he didn't tell this guy. He told him he was going to get attacked after the match, but he didn't say when, he didn't say by who. So Victor brought Tracy in to shoot on Jason the Terrible, right? Oh. So Tracy is under the ring, all day in this cold venue in Japan, right? And he's in this Jason the Terrible getup. This match happens. He comes out of the ring after the match and starts attacking Jason the Terrible, right? And you can see, the guy's going with it. He's selling whatever. But then Victor is right there. They've got his arm pulled over the guardrail, and he's like, break his arm, break his arm. And then Tracy does this hellacious chair shot to his arm off the apron. Right. And if that wasn't crazy enough, they're holding him again. Tracy goes to the goddamn top rope with his chair and jumps off and smashes his arm over the guardrail. And it's just this terrible thing. Right. And it's like, oh my God, like what happened? Right. So come to find out, Tracy managed to meet up with this Raphael later, this Jason the Terrible. They grabbed some Korean barbecue together, and Tracy apologized. He's like, hey man, I'm sorry. Victor told me this and that and whatever. And, I'm sorry. And, the dude was like, yeah, man, it's, I'm actually okay. It's not that bad, whatever. And then he was living in Japan. So whenever Tracy would come back to Japan for his tours, he would meet up with him. He'd give him oatmeal, he'd give him peanut butter, and he'd give him a batch of homemade cookies.
My goodness.
You're brought in as a hired gun to shoot on a guy. You end up apologizing to him later. You shoot on him, then you apologize to him, and then you bring him cookies. What a wholesome story.
Cycle of life. Let's talk about Smoky Mountain. Back in the States, he's there till the bitter end. They even briefly did a little interpromotional war with what's left of Memphis called the USWA. But of course, Smoky Mountain is Jim Cornette's baby, and before you know it, Cornette is wearing both hats and finds himself working full-time for the WWF on creative. And this is when I think Tracy gets another big break. He was probably able to credit Cornette with helping him get a spot in WCW, and now he does it again in the WWF. This time, though, he's not a wild-eyed Southern boy. He's not a young pistol. He's Freddie Joe Floyd, and I think he's being announced as being from Bowlegs, Oklahoma. And I guess there's a famous story about this being a rib on the Briscoes. What can you tell us about how he went to work for the WWF and this silly name, Freddie Joe Floyd?
Oh, man. So it was indeed Cornette that had pitched Tracy coming in. And what the WWF was trying to do at the time is they wanted to create their own enhancement guys, and not guys that lost every single time. They wanted to have some video packages of these guys, give them a couple wins so that they would have a little credibility, so that when a more established person defeated them, it wasn't like they were beating a nobody. They were beating somebody that had a little bit of credibility. So that's where the Goon, TL Hopper, Freddie Joe Floyd, there's a couple more. That's where these guys kind of fit into that era of WWF. And Bowlegs, Oklahoma is actually a real place. It is, it was named after a Billy Bowlegs, who was an Indian chief. And it's right around Seminole, Oklahoma, which is where Jack and Jerry Briscoe came from. And the story that I remember hearing was that there was a wrestler that had trained with Johnny Rods that was calling himself Larry Briscoe, right? And Jack Briscoe was not happy about this. He's just like, why of all the names are you going to take the Briscoe name? Like, I don't know you. I don't know who you are. You didn't ask permission, etc. Right? So Gerald had told Vince about this, and Vince was very amused that Jack was fired up about it. And then he thought, well, let's do something that'll piss him off even more. So right. Gerald's name is Floyd Gerald Briscoe, and Jack's name was Freddie Joe Briscoe. So they combined them. They made him from Bowlegs, Oklahoma, and that was it. I mean, that's the character, right? Just a weird thing. But if you look back on it, like I have in the last few days, he was surprisingly popular. He worked some matches with Bradshaw. He worked some stuff with Triple H, whatever. And just the crowd did not take a poop on him. Right. And you would think, like, what a weird podunk gimmick this is that is not going to register. But, he did a good job. He's there. He's ready to fight, ready to wrestle. Some of his promos are kind of funny to look back on. But this is a situation where you're dealt a hand that is not wonderful. Your checks are good, right? You're wrestling in front of big crowds, but you're not being featured in the way that would best suit you. But Tracy really made the most of it.
Yeah, he did, including having his Madison Square Garden debut against Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Mm-hmm. In fact, he even scored a win over Hunter on Raw. It was by countout after Mr. Perfect caused the distraction, but still, it's kind of cool to think that you're brought in to be an enhancement guy, and well, you're gonna wind up holding a win over the Prince of Wrestling, or at least the WWE, right?
And not only a win. If I don't know if this was intentional or if it wasn't quite his finish yet, but Tracy Smothers kicked out of a pedigree. He kicked out of the pedigree, and then that's when Hunter rolled out of the ring to confront Mr. Perfect, who was already down the ramp, and Tracy ends up getting that big win.
He's still making some shots for Lawler in Memphis down in the USWA. And of course, a lot of times down there, they would just carry over whatever was happening on WWF TV. So they create a little nation of domination down there. Of course, everybody remembers PG-13, but here Tracy Smothers is going to rename himself once he joins the nation, at least in Memphis, Shaquille Ali. My God, this is tremendous.
Yeah, Shaquille Ali. And this is just really funny to look back on, right? They had a guy named Kareem Olajuwon. The Spellbinder was Elijah. You had Jacqueline, or Miss Texas. She was Queen Moesha. Mo from Men on a Mission was Muhammad, of course. And then, of course, Tracy Smothers is Shaquille Ali, right? What a silly thing. But man, the couple matches I've seen him against Lawler. I saw him I forget, maybe King Cobra, I think was his other opponent, but it's just, he's got like a beanie on, he's got a black jacket on, he's doing the nation salute. It was just really surreal. I mean, there's so much more we're going to cover, but man, anything he gets, he just sinks every tooth into, and he just tries to squeeze the most out of it that he can.
And he made it work. And most famously, he made the next thing we're going to talk about work. And this is probably where more people listening to this remember Tracy than anywhere else. It's ECW. Eventually, the USWA is going to fold up shop. He still got this contract with the WWF, but we're very much in the talent trade era of that WWF and ECW relationship. So he becomes the main man, Tracy Smothers. He joins ECW, and of course, the full-blooded Italians. Yes, he's a member of FBI, along with Little Guido and Tommy Rich. He was introduced at the time as being from Nashville, Italy. This is great stuff, man. His dancing to the entrance music and dancing around to the chants. I think a lot of our listeners to this probably remember Tracy best for his ECW run. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, time out for 1 second. I'm trying to get my always faltering camera. Let me go ahead again. Let me start video. We good? Can you hear me? Hello?
I'm here.
Can you see me?
Yeah. Everything looks fine to me, but I'm going to let Stan answer. He's the one recording the video.
Sure. Yep. No problem. All right, give me a countdown.
3, 2, 1.
So the FBI, the full-blooded Italians, if I'm not mistaken, it started with journeyman JT Smith. He got a concussion, and then all of a sudden he thought he was Italian. He teamed with Val Puccio, and they added some people over the years. Damian Stone became Little Guido. Tracy had come into ECW. He knew Paul. I don't think he was very close with Paul, but Paul knew him and respected him. So he had, from what Tracy says, he was supposed to wrestle Terry Funk originally on that night, but that got switched around. He got moved around, and then he ended up wrestling Taz, and he basically earned himself a job. He held his own with Taz. The fans the fans enjoyed him, and they brought him back the following month. He teamed with Chetty, but then he just turned on Chetty right away, and then teamed with Guido and Tommy Rich, who had just formed. And this character, this style is something that would stick with Tracy for the rest of his career. It is so entertaining to go back and watch these matches. Like you mentioned, the entrance music, the entrance version of Staying Alive. This is kind of what started his like little group moving and grooving on the way to the ring, his dancing. And
something in the middle of the match to have a dance off. I know that sometimes people think, oh, this is stupid and blah, blah, blah with current stuff. And I guess you could have poked holes in this, but and that ECW audience ate it up. And I don't know, it was so different. You didn't expect a sort of an old school guy to be the guy doing it, but man, he pulled it off. Super entertaining stuff.
Yeah, the "Where's my pizza" chants. They had on their tights, "Shut up, you face," like "Shut up, you face."
Yeah.
Just a funny thing. He'd always make the dramatic unrolling of his Italian flag, and it had Tommy Rich's face airbrushed in the middle. The big Don Tommy Rich, just so funny. Like this little dance that Tracy started doing here, he would do pretty much every match for the rest of his career, regardless of whether there was anything going on with the FBI, regardless of whether there was a song you could dance to. And I believe he said in his book that this is just a little something that he picked up that Steve Armstrong was doing when they were down in Mexico. He's just kind of like, humping the crowd. Just a funny, silly thing. And God, what entertaining house show matches. There's a lot of fan cams that are available from that era. And it's just so cool to see the crowd completely eat this up. The notoriously difficult to please ECW crowd in certain situations, they just loved it. And then ECW changed Tracy's life. It changed his career because he was the guy that started running the workouts before the shows at ECW. A couple hours before doors open, he was in charge of getting guys in the ring and getting them reps. And that would be guys like Roadkill, Chetty, Doring, Wild Bill. But then it would also be guys like, whoever were the local crew that were there to help set up and get a look at. And that's how a lot of people got hired through ECW, the Hamricks and the Easy Monies, a guy named Chili Willie, the Musketeer. These guys, held their own in these workouts, and they ended up getting jobs from it. And then just everybody loved Tracy, and he had so much knowledge to pass on that, he'd have guys like Tommy Rich and New Jack in there, like chain wrestling. And how bizarre is that to think of?
So his run ends in '99 here with ECW, and he starts making random appearances all over the business. He even works Michael Hayes on a Shotgun Saturday Night appearance. He worked a worldwide taping in January of 2000. He's back on Jacked on February 21st. This shows you how universally loved this guy is. I mean, he's ECW, WCW, WWF. Everybody trusts Tracy Smothers and enjoys doing business with him. I don't know that anybody else could have even done this. In '99, I want to mention somewhere around here, I think I heard once upon a time that you met Tracy at a spot show, maybe Wisconsin, and you're like 19 years old. So the timeline would have been around this era, right?
Yeah, he was in ECW at the time. I had gotten booked through the internet to work a show in Platteville, Wisconsin. And I can get a little bit more into this at a later date because we're going to talk about all kinds of stuff here. But Conrad, do you know what my gimmick name was at this time?
I don't.
I was the wife beater. Yeah, I know it's terrible to think about now and to look back on, but it was something as an 18-year-old I thought was funny because I'm, an 18, 19-year-old kid, shaved head. I obviously don't have a wife, I'm wearing the wife beater shirt. It was kind of like a tongue-in-cheek thing that I did for a little while. So I got booked on this show as wife beater. And then there was a little bit of controversy. People were kind of boycotting this show and it just turned into this whole thing. So I wrestled the show as Chris Hero. I was doing shows as both at that time. But so I'm in Platteville, Wisconsin. There's a crew from Indiana. There was a group called WCWO, and they took, they brought the ring up there. They had some of the local wrestlers there. And I had been on a show with a couple name types before, but no one quite like Tracy. He was just so polite and so humble. There was, no stress or awkwardness about going and saying hi to him. He was just super genuine. And I had forgotten this up until recently, watching back one of my old shoots to kind of get stories for this. I wrestled a match on this show and, I lost the match, whatever. And then I'm trying to roll out of the ring to sell to the back. And Tracy comes out of the locker room and he comes over to me and he, helps me up. And he's like, "Hey man, hell of a match. You okay? You whatever." I don't know this man. I've said hi to this man today. And he's the name on the show. Like, what name wants to ruin their pop by coming out earlier in the show, right? But he just walks me to the locker room and is just super cool to me. And I just am so taken aback by this situation. Funny thing about this is I wouldn't start working with Tracy regularly until maybe like a year and a half after this. But when I saw him, I'm like, hey man, I don't know if you remember, we did this show. He's like, yeah, man, Platteville, Wisconsin, man. Did you ever get your money from that guy, man? My check bounced. So even though all these years later, and it was just this one chance encounter, like Tracy remembered me and he could not have been kinder to me. Yeah, I'll tell more later.
Well, ECW's done, WCW's done. Tracy's back on the indies and working all over the place. FMW, XPW, but mainly IWA Mid-South. And that's when you were first on my radar, Ian Rotten's promotion. Well, is this where you really get close with Tracy? What was your relationship like with him here in IWA Mid-South?
Yeah, I started with IWA in the summer of 2000 and around the same time of guys like Colt Cabana, CM Punk, Ace Steel, BJ Whitmer. A lot of us were, starting to go to these shows oftentimes twice a week. And it was Charlestown, Indiana, which is right across the bridge from Louisville, Kentucky. So it was a lot of that Southern post USWA crowd mixed in with the IWA fans that were fans of ECW. They were fans of deathmatch wrestling. So it was just a very interesting environment to be in. But we also had some veterans there. We had Ian Rotten, occasionally Axel Rotten would be there. And then we had Tracy. We had Bull Payne. We had a guy named Todd Morton. So it was just a mix of guys and a lot of people that we were able to learn from. And there wasn't anybody that could have been more helpful or more nice than Tracy Smothers. And I didn't know this at the time, but one of Tracy's deals would be that he would, if he was working heel on a show, he would just pick some guy in the locker room to kind of be, his second to get a little extra heat. Which again, I think stemmed from how successful the FBI stuff was in ECW. And then also Tommy Rich used to cut promos before those matches. And then, years later, Tracy's the one cutting the promos and using someone to draw the ref so he can cheat. Ian brought in Guido to have a match with Tracy. And Tracy's like, hey man, you come out to the ring with me? And I'm just, yeah, sure. I'll come out to the ring with you. And I've watched this match back recently and you can tell that I'm just scared shitless. And I'm not like, I just don't want to mess anything up. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of standing there. I'm covering Tracy's ears when they're saying bad things and whatever. And whenever Tracy gives me an Iggy to come in and do something, I go to try to do it as quick as I can. And this match, Tracy's like, hey man, when I draw the ref, I want you to come in and give Guido a move. And Guido, he doesn't know me. And I have to go, well, what do you think about this move? But it was just a thing that Tracy would do. And I would see him do it on, hundreds of shows over the years. But him having me come to the ring with him ended up becoming a regular thing. And then it just built our relationship. And he would watch my matches and he would always give me feedback. And God, he could not have been cooler, man. He's a guy that at 10, 11 years old, I was watching on TV. And here I am 19, 20, 21. And he is, like my big brother, like my wrestling uncle. And that would basically stick through the rest of my career.
Tell me about how Tracy was as a mentor, telling you stories, giving you advice, sharing a locker room with him. Who did he like in that locker room? Who didn't he like? Just give us some context to Tracy in this IWA Mid-South era.
So Tracy, I don't think there was really anybody that he didn't like. And he would tell stories to anybody. He would, if there's a monitor, he's going to put up his chair by the monitor and watch the show. If there's a door he can peek out of and watch the show, he's going to watch the show. And he's not going to bombard you when you come back and tell you all the things you did wrong. He's going to come over and put you over and tell you what was good. And then say, hey, have you ever thought about doing it this way or that way or the other? And just really beneficial and really helpful. just a great locker room guy. Just everybody loved hearing his stories. Everybody loved having him around. He'd be warming up for a match and he's doing his like isometrics where he's like, holding his abs real tight. He's like, doing his breathing. And then he goes into like a 5-minute shadow boxing routine. And he's got this like psycho look in his eyes. And you're just like, oh my God, he's going to kill somebody, he was a very intense individual. But I could not have asked for a better veteran to be in a locker room with, because that's who he was. He would help anybody. He didn't care. He'd tell you any story. He'd tell you all the things that he messed up throughout his career and what he wishes he had a chance to go back and do better or do differently. When I think of pro wrestling veteran, I mean, it's Tracy Smothers. It's the guy that, will bend over backwards to help you. And like I said in previous episode, he's the guy. That is what I aspire to be. I aspire to be to others what Tracy Smothers was to me and to, hundreds of others.
You said, so he would sometimes be candid with you about mistakes he had made along the way and things he wishes he had a do-over on. Can you give us an example of one of those?
Pissing people off, speaking up when it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. Sometimes when a situation happens, it's best to just let that situation happen and compose yourself before you start giving all your thoughts on it, because time will make you more rational.
Yep.
And pro wrestling and the adrenaline that it takes to perform, it's not always conducive to fostering. It's not to foster the relationships that you need to foster, because, I've been in matches with people where something is going wrong or it's not the way I want it, and I've yelled at them, but that doesn't mean that I'm mad at them or pissed at them.
Right.
But that's how it comes out in that moment, because I have adrenaline. So it's important to have a good enough connection with the person you're in there with that they know that you're not mad, or you can just control yourself a little bit better. And then Tracy, I saw him a couple times after matches, whether, like I said, he had concussions before wrestling, and, sometimes he'd get his bell rung out there and it would just fire him up. And, you come in the back and you look like he's looking for someone to fight or to whatever. And it's not that he's just trying to get his composure about him. And I think there were certain times in his career where he wishes he would have just let something go, or if he would just, sleep on it and then deal with it the next day. And that just, the country boy in him just would not let him. And there were several times that he had offended people and upset them. And, maybe that cost him a job, cost him a push, cost him a whatever.
Well, you talked about Tracy getting upset. Now feels like as good a time of any to talk about the old Tracy Smothers riot in Mid-South. It was recently uploaded to YouTube. You're all over the video. What happened?
Oh man, what a moment. Okay, so let me set the table. The match is an IWA Mid-South tag team, Mitch Page and Rollin' Hard. They were known as Mean and Hard. We're taking on Mark Wolf, and his surprise partner was beautiful Bobby Eaton. And they were also managed by Francine that night. So it's just a mishmash of everything there. And Tracy was not even involved in the match, right? Tracy was just on the show, and Bobby had come to the show in no condition to perform. He just was not, he should not have been in the match, but he went ahead and did the match anyway. And there was a point in the match when I think he maybe had done a neck breaker or something, and he's just having a hard time getting up off the mat. I don't know if he's actually injured or if he's just impaired or what, but Tracy, as I said, is watching the show, and he can see from where he is that Bobby's having a hard time, and the guys in the ring either don't understand or don't really know what to do. So Tracy takes it upon himself to just, march out to the ring, goes through the crowd, and then just starts attacking Bobby Eaton. completely 100% unplanned, unbooked. This is just Tracy trying to cover for what Bobby's going through in that moment. So the guys in the match are like, what the hell is going on? Like, what is, is this supposed to happen? Like, what's going on? And then, now, Bobby's on the floor now and they're like brawling, and they eventually do the finish of the match, which involved other people running out and doing stuff, which just becomes very convoluted. Yeah. And now all of a sudden, Tracy is just fighting everyone. People are trying to, it's like a big pull apart angle, right? That wasn't booked, and it's not even an angle. They're not even going to work together, right? So we've got people holding Bobby back, and Bobby won't stop either. Bobby just keeps going, no, whatever, and Tracy just starts fighting all of us. There are at least 3 times during this scuffle that Tracy attacks me, and it's so funny to look back on, because he's always like, oh man, it's okay. Man, I'm sorry. I'll stop. And he'll like grab my hand and then short arm clothesline. I'm like, God damn it, Tracy. He's taking guys, he's throwing them through chairs, he's doing whatever. And it's just this chaotic scene that none of us know what's going on. We're just trying to do this. Now, Ian is out there now, and Ian's like, he's grabbing the mic and trying to make an angle out of it. Like, Tracy, if you don't stop it right now, you're not going to get paid for the night. Or, next Wednesday, you and Bobby Eaton will have a match and settle this, so he's just trying to book something on the fly. Right. I have another moment where I'm trying to talk Tracy down, and I'm like, hey man, hey, cool. And then he, oh yeah. And he thumbs me in the eye and, is just attacking me. So what happens to make this a riot is that they brawl around the building for like the 5th time. They start diving through the crowd, and it's just this uneasy, chaotic scene of what's going on. And there's a woman there that has a mini baseball bat, like one of those, mini wooden baseball bats. Yep. And I feel like it has barbed wire on it. Don't quote me on that. But as Tracy is lunging through the crowd, he grabs her by the arm. And a story that I heard is that this woman was pregnant, like just newly pregnant, and was terrified. And instead of just getting the hell out of the way, she's there. So Tracy grabs her to go through the crowd, and she turns around and hits him right in the face with this baseball bat. So instantly, this girl's boyfriend has his shirt off and is like, come on, let's go, whatever. And then there's another guy that took his shirt off, and they're, everybody's trying to pull them apart. And now Tracy is crossing over from like pro wrestler, I'm trying to get heat, to like, oh my God, I'm going to take someone's eye out. Right. So now this, we're trying to calm him down. He's still trying to bump us. We're trying to figure out what's going on with this girl. Is this girl okay? We need to calm her boyfriend down. Let's put a shirt on him. And then all of a sudden they get back in the ring, and then there's some more brawling. And then there's another fan in the crowd that takes his shirt off. I don't know what it is about taking your shirt off, unless it's obstructive to you when you're trying to fight. But this guy takes his cigar out and burns it on his forearm like he's Joe LaDuke or something. Oh. And then he's trying to fight Tracy. So we're like, what is going on? Like, so they legit took Tracy's gear bag, and I think he had ridden with Adam Gooch, Adam came in from Evansville, so they probably traveled together. They take his stuff, we chuck it out of the building, and they just leave from the building. And I believe Tracy called Ian from a payphone, or like, hey man, I'll pay you next week. Don't worry. We'll do some good business with this. So I'm 22. Yeah. I'm in the business for 4 years, not even 4 years at that time. And this chaotic thing is happening. It's so surreal. And I watched the whole thing in its entirety recently, and it still blows my mind that something like this happened.
If you didn't get to see Tracy work independence, you really missed out. I'll never forget seeing him do his thug spiel, but also too, he knew how to manipulate the crowd and do those old famous X-rated ECW chants when the time was warranted. And then he would do a lot of mic work where, in addition to the crazy entrance and the dance off and, the thug spiel, he's also going to say stuff where he calls himself a murderer and a psycho. And if anybody says this, and if I hear that one more time, and if any of you rednecks decide to do insert random thing they're about to do, everybody dies. I don't know that there was a more entertaining independent performer than Tracy Smothers in that era. Could anybody get more out of a crowd doing less than Tracy Smothers? He had it down pat.
Oh, absolutely not. And there's two different types of heat, right? There's like the heat that is good for business. It's like, yeah, we want to see this guy get beat up. And then there's the go away heat, like, oh, I'm just not entertained. I don't like this.
Yeah.
But Tracy had a good way to get that good kind of heat to really piss people off. But at the same time, the ones who are in on it are enjoying it just as much, and just everybody's playing along. And he just was so good with that. He had Tracy. There's two things that Tracy loved in promos a lot, and one is alliteration. He also loved rhyming things. Like you just look back, especially on those Smoky Mountain promos, and he just we can't get along, so we're gonna get it on. He would do his Tracy, psycho, sellout, smasher, Smoky Smothers, right? Or he'd say, I'm going to commit ultra mega mass homicide. That was one of his. He would say, I'm going to take this shirt off. I'm going to take this jacket off, and the divorce rate's going through the roof. He just had so many fun little bits that you can enjoy. But also the locals or the casuals would just get so furious and so pissed off. I'm going to fight that baby. I'm going to come over there and I'm going to slap your child, just silly things like that. And when you were out there, it was so hard to not smile. It was so hard. And it was hard for him to not smile sometimes, and
he would, and he'd find somebody in the crowd who got it and give him a wink. And he was having fun. You could tell. Yeah.
And if they were cheering him instead of booing him, he'd be like, Hey, y'all, work with me. I'm a heel. Come on. And he also was just the master of the double, triple, quadruple turn, where he would start out as a heel, then he would turn face, then he'd turn back heel, that he would just, and the thing is, sometimes when a guy's had the microphone for over 15 minutes, you're just like, oh my God, next, whatever is next, just happen, please. But with Tracy, he just always had such a good gauge for it, and just really funny moments. But then also you want to see the baby. Another thing he would always do, he would always start his promo and talk about how much everybody sucks and the local football team and this and that. And then he would go to his opponent and he'd be like, hey, how about it for him? How about a big hand for him? He's a tough competitor. And everybody like, yeah. And then he would proceed to put his opponent over like a babyface for like 2 minutes. And then he would say he's going to bust him up and beat him up and give him the wrestling lesson of a lifetime. Just had so much, ebb and flow with the crowd. And it was never not entertaining, even in his later years of wrestling, where he didn't have the same physical gifts that he once had. You knew that you were going to get at least 30 minutes of entertainment whenever Tracy was coming out.
It's pretty remarkable when you go through all that this guy's accomplished. And I've always really wondered, why is there not a spot for a guy like Tracy Smothers down in developmental? You were in NXT for a long time. To the best of your knowledge, does a guy like Tracy Smothers' name ever even come up?
His name would come up a lot, just because guys loved him and he was revered. But he unfortunately was a part of that whole concussion lawsuit. I don't know a ton about that, but obviously if you are part of a team that is filing a lawsuit against the company, there's no chance that you're going to come in and do anything with the company. Unfortunately, that was the situation with Tracy. But at the same time, I didn't talk with Tracy all the time, but he would send me occasional messages asking how I was. And man, he was just my number one fan. He supported me from the very first time I met him, up until the last time we talked. And we just had little inside things. He'd always call me Superman. Hey, Superman. he, from when I was 19, 20, he would just be like, hey man, we gotta get you in the gym more, man. I'm like, you know what I'm gonna do? When's your birthday? I'm gonna get you a tent. I'm gonna get you a tent. You can put that up in the gym. So you just wake up and go right to the gym. So he just had these fun little things that were supportive and constructive, and regardless of what company I was working for, he never held any grudges for anything like that. He just kind of knew how the business was, and he knew his place in the business. He was still, to his last days, trying to get on shows, trying to get people in cars, trying to just get the most out of everything. A very cool thing that he was able to do. I don't know how many of the listeners here are familiar with the band Gwar. They are this crazy, rock band that have these elaborate outfits with, it's like latex rubber, but it's these crazy skulls and body parts. And
like horror masks.
Yeah, exactly. It looks like something out of a horror movie, and they've got all this blood and everything. Well, Dave Brocky, who has since passed, was Odorous Orungus, and just this crazy intergalactic demon. Well, Madman Pondo in West Virginia booked Tracy Smothers versus Odorous Orungus in a loser leaves Earth match. And for Tracy to go out there and do his same shtick, Tracy comes out with like an alien mask on, and he's got his like stick that he would carry to the ring with him. And to work a match with this guy who's got all this weird latex body armor on, it's just a testament to all the things he was able to do. He did countless Gathering of the Juggalos, and he, did some tours and matches for ICP's wrestling company, JCW. There wasn't anything that he couldn't do. And while he may not have gotten to a point in his career where he could retire off of wrestling and have like a cushy office job or a cushy trainer's job, there were always people that were going to book Tracy, like we said earlier. Jim Cornette is a guy that always looked out for him, but Ian Rotten is also a guy that always booked Tracy. Tracy said, man, anytime I get fired, I just have to call Ian, and he'd have me booked the next day. So he always had people looking out for him, regardless of what level they were on.
Let's talk about Tracy as a trainer. I mean, you saw him mentor countless guys. I mean, he certainly had that reputation, but you were close enough to be able to assess how he was as a trainer, maybe his biggest strengths or weaknesses when it came to teaching.
I think the strength would be his demeanor and how much he cared. Like I said, he had nicknames for people. He had inside jokes for people, but that just went to show you that, these weren't just names. These were people that he had relationships with. So I posted a thing on Twitter, a couple days after Tracy passed, I believe, about, hey, what nicknames did Tracy give you? And just the flood of people coming through with just different, and he had funny reasons for these nicknames, and just, he was very good at establishing rapport with young guys and also making them feel good about themselves. It's a hard business. It's a very critical business. And it is hard to separate the art from the artist, right? If I have a shitty match, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a piece of shit, right?
Right.
But it feels like that. When you have a match and you see someone tear it apart, whether to your face or you read a review of the show and people are super critical of it, it is so hard not to take that stuff personally. So it was very important for Tracy to just be complimentary, and man, he would make you feel like $1 million, but then he would also give you a couple things to work on. And not only would he give you those things to work on, he would also check back with you later and be like, hey man, you're doing that thing good. That's real, and just show an active interest in your career. And that's not something that's easy to do. Tracy spent a little bit of time down in Memphis, coaching developmental, where he spent time with guys like American Dragon, Spanky, Brian Kendrick, Molly Holly, the Mean Street Posse. And here's a fun little tidbit here. Brian Kendrick's Sliced Bread was given to him by Tracy Smothers. Tracy had seen a guy do it. I think maybe it was Kid Chaos from XPW who had picked it up from Sabu or wherever it came from. Tracy goes, "Hey man, this is a pretty cool move. You should do it." And to this day, sliced bread is Spanky's finish. Tracy wrestled Rhino in ECW before Rhino had an actual deal for them. And he's like, "Hey man, why don't you just give me a damn football tackle?" Right. So sure enough, Rhino hits him with this gore that, wasn't named the gore yet, but it became the staple that is, stuck with him to this day. So Tracy was good about finding out what would work best for you. And he was very unselfish. He was just very good at just giving, if you had a match with him, he'd want to know what you want to do. Yeah, man, we'll do that. We'll do that. No problem. I would say if I'm looking for an actual weakness, I'm going to say that there are some people over the years that Tracy probably gave the benefit of the doubt to that he shouldn't have, or some people that maybe took advantage of his kindness. There were guys that he would, get booked and travel with and do whatever that wouldn't necessarily look out for Tracy when they needed to. Yeah. And that's unfortunately a thing that happens. But once that happens one or two times and you get burned, it's hard to trust people again. But with Tracy, he just loved wrestling, man. He loved wrestling. He loved helping people in the business. I know I mentioned earlier that, he always thought that one day he was going to settle down and be a football coach in his hometown, but he really was our coach. He was our mentor. He was selfless and he just gave everything that he had to the business. And then he gave it to those that he cared for in the business.
Real quick, I want to talk about, something I knew Tracy hated, and that was bullies. He very famously did, I couldn't tell you how many interviews where he called out JBL after the one night stand 2005 situation where JBL essentially beat up the Blue Meanie. It was supposed to be working and he was throwing live rounds at Meanie, and Meanie had staples in his head from a couple nights before. And it was a shitty, bloody mess. And Tracy was pretty hot about it. Did you ever talk to him about that?
Yeah. He absolutely got fired up when that happened. And the stuff that came afterward, I would call it more of a worked shoot because he saw how much publicity he was getting and he saw how many bookings he was getting. So he's just like, all right, I got something good. I'm going to go with it. But if you asked him about it, Bradshaw is a guy that he had known when he first broke in. And then when it came time to work with Tracy in WWF, was not the same guy. He was not as cordial as he was. If you look back in the first Tracy the first Freddie Joe Floyd versus Justin Hawk Bradshaw match, which is Tracy's first win in WWF, all day Bradshaw had told him, "Hey man, I'm kicking out, which would be something that you would joke about. Right. But if you look back on it, he legit kicks out of the finish, which it's not like a strong kick out where the guy kicks out just on 3 to try to save a little face, which a lot of people do when they shouldn't do. It's good in the right situation. It's like the Lex Luger kick out strong gimmick. But in this situation, he kicks out and the ref stops and the ref starts the count again. And then he kicks out again. And then Freddie Joe Floyd gets the 1, 2, 3, but it's not cool. It's like awkward. It loses momentum of the match. And it's just, what a shitty thing to do. And then in their return match, just Bradshaw just beats him with a clothesline. And it's like, well, what was really the point in that? It just didn't really do any favor. There's also a difference, and I can go into this at a much later date, but there's a difference between bumping and selling. They're not the same thing. You can bump without selling, which is like, Road Warrior Hawk taking a pile driver and popping up and it doesn't phase him. But you can also sell without bumping, which is like Yokozuna. He's like, whoa, or Bam Bam Bigelow or one of those big guys. So some people don't always have the right idea of bumping and selling, and especially when you're a big guy. But in this situation, Bradshaw's taking bumps for him, but he just didn't really put Tracy over in the way that he should. I don't know if there was resentment from that boiled over 20 years later, but he absolutely pulled a cheap shot on Blue Meanie. And there was all this talk about whether or not, could Tracy really beat up Bradshaw? But I think if you look at the record and from many stories that other people have told where I was not there, you hear about Bradshaw getting knocked on his ass, and you know that if Tracy's really mad about something, he'll take your eyeball out. So I think there's no question about who I think would win in the fight between those two.
Before we wrap things up, what's your craziest Tracy Smothers story?
Oh my God, the bear stories are great. The riot story is great. There's the ECW story about there's a bit of a riot with the crowd, and the cops get called in, and now the cops are not just fighting the crowd, the cops are fighting the wrestlers. And Tracy, like I said, he is the first on call when something's going on, and he's ready to protect those that he loves and cares for, or protect the business or whatever he needs to. There's a situation, he's in there showering, and he's like, oh man, he comes out, he grabs a towel, he's got soap still in his hair. And then there's like a police dog that's like, on a leash, but just about to get Dreamer, like, rah, rah, rah. And then like Tracy backs up to me, goes, don't worry, man, I got the dog, man. And just that's the epitome of Tracy. He's willing to fight a police dog to defend a friend of his in a situation where he doesn't even know what the situation is, but he's there to support his friend.
Well, we can't tell the story without telling the sad part. How did you find out, and when did you find out that Tracy was sick?
I found out online, like a lot of people. I believe there was a show for Bobby Eaton where a lot of the guys got together, and Tracy had been sick for a little while. He had some abdominal pain, and he thought it was an ulcer, and he just didn't get it checked up the way he should have. So by the time he finally went, he found out he had cancer, and he was dealing with this in private. He didn't want anybody to worry. He didn't want people to think he was, sick, or just that it didn't look good. But he wanted to pay his respects and showed up at this show. And I think a lot of people were taken back by, he was a bit more frail. His hair was gone. And then that's kind of, he put out a statement saying that he had the cancer, and, it just rocks you. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And, I didn't message him immediately. You kind of don't want to believe it. Right. So I had tried to think of a way that I could help him. And I looked up and I saw this GoFundMe that was out there, and the damn thing only had like $120. And I was just like, oh my God, I don't know the guy that put this up. I don't know if it's really his. So I reached out to Tracy and asked how he was. And then I asked like, hey, is this legit? And he's like, yeah, that's the guy. They put it up for me. And I just thought that he deserved the best from anybody. He had always given his best to everybody. And then I kind of sat on that for a couple of days. And then I just said, fuck it. I'm going to try to do something. So I opened up a GoFundMe. I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured it out. I had his permission. And then I decided to talk to some artist friends of mine. These guys with the Spotlight series, The Struggles, and I had them whip up some artwork of Tracy fighting a bear. It's comic book style, kind of like the Wolverine versus Hulk, right? That was kind of the inspiration for it. And I thought, you know what, let's go ahead and launch this at the same time, so that one, we get a cool t-shirt going out there that people aren't just donating money, that they're actually purchasing something that is his spirit. But then let's also try to get some word out about this GoFundMe, so that people that do have the means to donate can. And, I put it out there, and I was blown away. I almost set it for $5,000 just because, I don't know anything about this. I thought, maybe that'll be attainable. But at the last minute, I decided to do 10,000. And then, within a couple of days, boom, that was done. And I think all said, we raised a little over 15,000 from the GoFundMe, plus a couple extra thousand from the t-shirt. And I was able to get that money to Tracy, just to help him deal with everything that was going on, because, it was expensive. The chemo that he had to go through, it was a very rough time for him. And, gosh, he never complained once. He told me how hard it was and how difficult certain parts of it were. But he was just always so appreciative and just so great that some people came through with some incredible donations. You can still, I think the GoFundMe, you can still access it and see who all donated. And it's just people from, every wrestling company in the world, put some money toward that. And that's just a testament to what kind of a guy he was and what kind of legacy he'll leave on wrestling.
What was your last conversation like that you had with Tracy? Do you recall?
I'd had 2 separate hour and a half conversations with Tracy about, in the 10 days before he passed. And it was awesome to talk to him. And I would ask him questions about certain parts of his career, and he would check up, hey man, how's this guy doing? Or how's he doing? Or what are you doing? He just, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic and people are quarantining, and, we're kind of discussing that a little bit. But I'll actually pull something up right now. I've got a voicemail from Tracy. I got a couple that I've kept, and just, something that I will cherish. I'm glad that we're able to have things like this. The last time I actually spoke with Tracy was because he butt dialed me. We had just gotten off the phone from this super long call, and then I sat the phone down. I came back a couple minutes later and saw that I had a missed call from him, and I was like, oh shit, did he forget to tell me something? And I called him back, and he's like, oh man, I got you in the pocket, I'm sorry, man. So that was the actual last time I talked with Tracy. One of the nights we got off the phone, and then like 20 minutes later he sends me a text and he says, call me crazy, but someday I want to get back in the ring with you, Superman, LOL. And it would have been my pleasure. I feel very fortunate to have known him, so deeply and throughout the entirety of my career. When someone passes away, you always wish you could have had more time with them or whatever, but it's just unfortunately the sad truth of life. People pass, and we just have to remember them the best way that we can and just move on in the best way that we can. But I am just so appreciative that I was able to have him in my life.
What do you think will be Tracy's legacy in the wrestling business?
One of a kind. He's one of a kind. He left an imprint on every single person he crossed paths with in pro wrestling. He has a legion of people that he mentored that he set such a great example for, to how to treat others. A friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Jason, had Tracy over one weekend because they did some shows, and yeah, man, I'll let you stay at my house. He woke up, and in the morning, Tracy was sitting at the table with his grandpa eating a bowl of cereal, and Tracy's just sitting there in his tighty whities, right? Just reading the paper and just talking like an everyday man. I read from someone that they had Tracy booked for a triple shot of shows one weekend, and Tracy woke up before them, and they looked out, and Tracy was cutting their damn lawn. Like, he's just was so selfless, and so many people have these great stories of his generosity. And just, what a kind guy he was, and how hard of a worker he was, man. Hardest working man in the business, Tracy Smothers, man. That's the legacy he'll leave.
Well, Chris, I don't know what I expected with today's episode. I love Tracy Smothers, but you obviously got to know him a lot better than any of us did. And this was such a important episode, and he really is one of the unsung heroes of professional wrestling. And it's a reminder to all of us about how short life can be and how fragile life can be, and to really tell the folks who are important to you how important they are to you right now while you still have the opportunity. I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'll tie this in with a little word of wisdom that I think we can all gain from Tracy Smothers. And that is, if you are, if you're in the wrestling business, if you're coming up and want to be a wrestler or want to be a part of pro wrestling, you have to remember that wrestling owes you nothing. The only thing wrestling owes you is a stiff ring to bump in, right? And when you start to look at pro wrestling as something that you need to get something out of, you just run the risk of ending up jaded and disappointed. So it's important to just look at everything that you're able to do through wrestling and appreciate it to the fullest. And Tracy is a guy that had every right to be bitter and beaten up and just had jilted and he'd been screwed over and whatever. He should have hated wrestling, right? If you look at it that way. But he's a guy that always enjoyed what he did. He always appreciated what he did. And he was always able to inspire others and just help others. So just, if you catch yourself looking around and keeping score with certain people about what they were able to do in their career or what they're getting and what you're not getting, that's just a recipe for disaster, because you're going to end up feeling badly about this thing that's great, this thing that's wonderful, this thing that we should all love. It's a privilege to get to do this, and we should never look at it as anything other than that.
Well said. I don't know how we'll ever top this episode, because I just love Tracy Smothers, but we're going to be back next week. What are you in the mood to talk about next week, Chris? Let's do a lighter subject. Let's do a happy one.
So I think the best route to go in here is to kind of tell the story about how we get to where we are right now with my career. In January 2017, I made my return to NXT after a pretty successful couple years back on the indies. A lot of people want to know why I decided to come back, especially now that I've been fired for a second time. So I'm just going to take you guys into my mindset going back into that and what it was like to step back into NXT, which was a completely different NXT.
And by the way, we would love to hear your suggestions. We're not just trying to do a show for ourselves. We want to do a show for you. So what are you in the mood to hear? What would you like to hear the Wrestling Genius talk about? Go ahead and tweet at us, and be sure to use the hashtag Chris Hero. Do you want to run down your social handles for everybody so we can keep the conversation going?
I am at Chris Hero on Twitter. I'm at Chris Hero on Instagram. You could put my name into Pro Wrestling Tees, and I got some new stuff up there. The end of February, I'm kind of throwing myself back out there. I'll be doing a Sign It Live via High Spots. So it'll be nice to kind of interact with some fans again, something I've missed sorely, just waiting for the right situation to come back. So man, please feel free. I also started a Twitter at Can Chris Hero. You can't have so many letters. So I just am responding to people that have had some feedback about the show. So I've got that started. And then also, like I said, I want to end every show with a musical recommendation. I think today we're going to take a break from that already on show number 2. But the reason is with Tracy passing last year, it just, it just shows you how close things can be. And a lot of people were affected by a lot of things in 2020 and, just some financial hardships, but then there was just a lot of health issues and unfortunately a lot of death. So we've put together a little bit of a memorial that's going to play after this video of the people that we lost that were associated with wrestling in the year 2020. And I just, I had a great relationship with Tracy, and there's, many people that passed last year that I didn't know personally, but they obviously did have friends and family and fans that cared about them deeply. So I wanted to just take a moment and pay tribute to a lot of those people that passed away, because the business really, got a hurt and put on it last year, and just wanted to do our part to spread awareness for some of these people.
Let's do that. It's a great idea. And, it's coming up next right here. We're going to pay tribute to those that we lost in the professional wrestling business in 2020. But we're going to be back next week talking about a more happy time, a more happy subject. Tell your friends about your favorite new wrestling podcast. It's Can Chris Hero Save Wrestling right here on Ad Free Shows. And we'll see you next week. But now, watch this.